Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another session of this mega conference hosted by OP Jindal Global University in India. We've been discussing various aspects of universities and universities' contributions to the world, to their own countries and societies. And this particular panel is exactly focused on what universities can do for the global goals, these 17 goals announced by the United Nations and signed up by all the countries of the world in 2015, what we call the Millennium. It was initially called Millennium Development Goals and then extended as Sustainable Development Goals. So for the next 2015 to 2030, we are supposed to be all working towards these big milestones. And let me just remind you, some of them include, ending extreme poverty, ending hunger, providing decent education, healthcare, gender equality, employment and economic growth. And there are a host of other related socioeconomic goals. So now the question is, what happens in the context of this mega calamity that the world has suddenly been thrown into in the last 1.5 years, which is the COVID-19 pandemic and its devastating impact. We are seeing it right now, especially in large developing countries. It affected India very badly a few months ago, and now Indonesia, another heavily populated country of Asia, is being talked about as the epicenter. And then a lot of Africa and Latin America continue to be facing this the wrath of the pandemic even as we talk. So there is, and then the richer countries of the world, North America and Europe, went through several phases of extreme suffering as well, and have now started emerging. So there is, and then there is a fear of a recurrence in the form of next waves and then following waves. So this has become a kind of an unending nightmare almost, with no clear endpoint in sight. So in this context, what happens to all the SDGs? I mean, the UN and most of the other affiliated organizations are saying that pretty much the entire sustainable development goals, all of them have been set back severely by the pandemic, and we are facing a regression or even a collapse of some of these goals. SDG number 1, which is about poverty itself, the World Bank and others are saying 3 to even possibly even 400 million people are going to fall into extreme poverty worldwide, is the first time that almost all these indices are regressing after making somewhat reasonable steady progress in one direction, which was up for about 15-20 years. So the challenge before us in universities is very severe. It's not only to our own bottom lines and to our own finances, but to the wider society. So, and our stakeholders as universities, obviously not limited just to students. There's a wider society in which, and the communities in which we are embedded, and we are seeing a lot of suffering and a lot of inequality and a lot of tragedies as we speak. So in this context, we have a wonderful panel to discuss this, what we could do, what we are already doing, and what else could be done in our through our institutions as higher education institutions, what we can do to further this goal in a time when the goals are just receding and simply vanishing, and people are unable to see hope. So what can we do? And to discuss this, I've got a very eminent panel. Let me introduce them to you. I have Professor Cudd, who is the Provost and Senior Vice Chancellor at the University of Pittsburgh in the US. Welcome, Professor Cudd. I have Professor Stephanie Marshall, Vice Principal of Queen Mary University of London. I have Professor Chris Glass, Vice President of the Star Scholars Network in the US. Welcome, Professor Glass. I have Professor Paul Tonks from Yonsei University in South Korea. He's Associate Vice President for International Affairs. And last but not least, I have Juan Pablo Lascurain, our friend from Mexico at the Tecnológico de Monterrey. He is the Rector for Higher Education there. So a very interesting geographically spread out panel, and I hope that brings in lots of regional perspectives from different parts of the world on this big question. Let me begin with Professor Cudd, and ask her what she thinks about the impact of this on the SDGs. I mean, at the intellectual level, Professor Cudd, obviously, many of us think and write about these issues. The Vice President of India just inaugurated this virtual conference yesterday and was emphasizing that universities must do a lot to address and to study and to research socioeconomic and political problems, especially since the pandemic has hit all of us so hard. But so there are two elements. One is the intellectual output, and our scholars continue to grapple with these issues, especially the ones in humanities and social sciences. But as universities as a whole, how do you think we have been responding? Have we been on the sidelines and not really been able to make an impact, or do you think universities are doing something valuable that will be remembered as part of this crisis fighting, and especially in light of the SDG goals that I mentioned, which are all in decline? So what do you think I mean, obviously, education is one of the major goals in itself, but even otherwise across all the, would you like to comments by talking about maybe your experience at Pittsburgh and in your community, and what the university has been doing, and of course, last but not least, what your scholars have been doing to try and raise awareness about these issues and the mega problems we're facing?
Great, sure, I'd love to address that. Thank you very much, Sreeram. And first, let me say that I'm honored and delighted to participate in this discussion with these panelists, these distinguished panelists, as part of this really fascinating, impressive international summit. So thank you to your university as well. Universities are well positioned to promote and support the Sustainable Development Goals because they bring together the best minds and people eager for knowledge, for inquiry, and then, at least in the best situations, give them the freedom and support to question and seek answers to hard problems. So universities have the ability to, I think, change culture by focusing attention on ethical problems, like through the humanities and social sciences, as you mentioned, and from many diverse perspectives. But in turn, universities seek out important research topics and needs that society has to focus on. The Sustainable Development Goals together pose the great challenges of human life on this planet. Each one opens a wide potential area of focused study and experimentation. It's really an entire curriculum in the 17 goals. I see many different kinds of networks that come together to focus on particular areas of sustainable development. You know, back in the 19th century in the United States, the US Moral Land Grant College Act of 1862 set aside federal lands to create colleges to benefit the agriculture and the mechanical arts, as it was stated in the act. And this network of universities created the Green Revolution in agriculture and continues to work together for the benefit of society through, for example, the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. And then another more recent example of a network of universities that the University of Pittsburgh is involved with is with Newcastle University in the UK. We're forging a network of universities that are focusing on the role of place-based universities that are engines of reinvention in their Rust Belt cities with declining 20th century industries, attempting to forge new, greener economies. So in terms of specific sustainable development goals, I would say that depending on the university's context, its place, each one could be centered in a curriculum or in the research mission of the university. But speaking for Pitt, the University of Pittsburgh in particular, as a major health, science, and medical school, we are certainly focused on health and well-being, as well as on, of course, education, gender equality. And we're poised in Pittsburgh at the confluence of three great rivers with a history of major polluting industry, the steel industry, coal. We're in the heart of Appalachia. And so water quality is a really important topic for our researchers and our students. and of course, energy and climate change. But as a public university located in a city with significant inequalities in our surrounding communities, we serve the goals of economic growth for decent work, sustainable cities and communities. Reducing inequalities is an important goal of ours, which I might be able to talk about later in this panel, as well as climate action, of course. So I'll stop now.
Yeah, great. So thank you for this opener, because it sets the, especially public universities, have historically had a very important role to support social and economic activities. And so I think it's obvious. Now, let me shift to Professor Stephanie Marshall, who is in London. And like the US, the UK also has gone through a very wrenching kind of a crisis. And we hear that only so-called Freedom Day has just arrived, but there's still a lot of nervousness around. There's been a lot of suffering in communities, we know. So how has Queen Mary positioned itself, and your scholars, how are they addressing, and the student community? I'd like to bring students in also, because obviously it's not just our researchers and scientists and social scientists, but also young people who are, I know Queen Mary has a very active student community that's engaged in community issues. So Professor Marshall, your thoughts on this big setback to the SDGs due to the pandemic, and how have you adjusted in the last 1.5 years to this in terms of the goals?
Right, thank you very much, Sreeram. Like Anne, I'm just absolutely delighted to be here, and congratulations to you and your university for hosting such an eminent conference, and so timely to get our heads back in this space as we begin to emerge. And of course, Monday was our Freedom Day, where we were supposed to actually feel a lot safer about the pandemic having receded in the UK. I wouldn't say we're that confident. The majority of people are still wearing their face coverings as they move about, and I think quite rightly so. But in terms of looking at the SDGs, when I arrived at Queen Mary 3 years ago as Vice Principal with responsibility for education, it also coincided with devising a new strategy, our Strategy 2030. And our Strategy 2030, if you look at it, is so much about embedding those 17 SDGs. So we were on this track in terms of what are we about? I mean, we're based in the East End of London. If anybody knows London, you'll know that it's the poorest part of London. We always say we're the Russell Group with a real difference, because through our DNA is the notion of social justice. Mm-hmm. Why do staff come to us? Because they're absolutely passionate about social justice. They're amazing researchers, but they're amazing educators, and they want to also be doing the education in the community as well as with our students on campus. Yeah. Our student body is predominantly non-white. Over 50% of them commute to us from the local area, and over 40% of them are the first in their family to come to university, and about 15 to 20% come from families with a really, I'd say, inadequate annual salary going into those households. So they're coming to us with our vision of being open the doors of opportunity. So we're absolutely committed to opportunity. And I have to say on that one, in terms of thinking about SDG 4, absolutely, it's our passion is to offer a quality education. We also, of course, have a very world-class medical and dental school, Barts in the London, which has been doing work in this area of pandemics and immunology. So when the pandemic came, we had been making progress with our huge commitment to diversity and inclusivity and success. And so as soon as the pandemic came, obviously, like every other university, we went online, but we were so concerned about our local community. So if I look at what's happened then with our medical and dental school, immediately they turned their hand to asking what could we do to the government in terms of our research. And I think that was across a number of medical schools, But we, of course, based in London, were right there working so closely with the Chief Scientific Officer, the Chief Medical Officer, and particularly in the East End, we started partnering more tightly and closely than ever with our public health in Tower Hamlets, the local London borough in which we work. I was amazed how our students became so mobilized to say, we've got to help. Medical students then were volunteering in the hospitals. And I have to say, post-traumatic stress became something that we had to then be concerned about with some students. And so rapidly, others supported them in terms of developing apps to help support them in terms of mindfulness. So our research really shifted. How do we support frontline workers? A number of our clinicians working in the medical school then became frontline workers themselves, whilst also trying to teach online. In terms of our research, within the humanities as well, I mean, social anthropologists then thinking we need to then study this and look at how we can, what can we learn from the past and that might help us in the future. So we were looking back to previous plagues, pandemics, etc., and seeing what we could learn to help us move forward. But I think the huge commitment then was not just to our students, who were absolutely amazing and helping each other, helping staff in terms of what online might look like, but how can we help local schools? How can we help the local colleges? Getting used to operating in either Zoom or Teams and making sure that we did our best. If you look at our curriculum, we have what we call the Inclusive Curriculum Project. And in our Inclusive Curriculum Project, we've looked at then how do we also embed the SDGs. So you can see in terms of our curriculum, a number of the SDGs are offered via projects where they're not embedded in the curriculum. Then they feature maybe as a potential to do an interdisciplinary internship, dissertations, etc. So there's an awful lot going there, so that we're keeping the ideas flowing. So in terms of a setback, I'd say I think what's happened is it's a pause button. I think inequalities is the thing that we've been most concerned about. And I think whilst we've had a chance to think more, also to be able to reflect and think the world needs to be a kinder place, how do we bring that about? By making sure we look at those inequalities in even more detail globally and make sure that we wade in and do our bit to help. It isn't just in terms of people, it's also in terms of, for example, we do an awful lot of work on, for example, saving turtles, because we've got a crisis in that. Looking at solar energy, let's ramp that up and get moving more on that. I could go through a number of examples, but I think if anything, it's helped us accelerate that 2030 strategy in terms of our commitment and ambition, because I think we've become, if anything, more passionate that we have to vote with our feet, with pragmatic, practical work now to help move the agenda forward. Because if universities don't, who will? We've got to empower our graduates. And I have to say, and I'm sure this is a global phenomenon, across universities, our students love the planet. They're very precious about the planet. They want the planet to survive. And I think I don't know of any student that isn't wholly signed up to those 17 SDGs. And we've got to serve them well in the global citizens of the future. One further point that I think is worth raising is we've got what we call graduate attributes. So what do we want a culinary graduate to look like as they go in, and what distinguishes them from other graduates? And you could say, you look at these from universities and are they more or less the same? Well, we have that commitment to global citizenship and to be promoting the goals of sustainable development.
Oh, it's embedded in your attributes. Okay.
Yes,
yeah, no, that's all inspiring actually to hear that, when the chips are down, the universities are raising their hands and saying we want to do something out of the ordinary and to support communities. I think ultimately, like Anne Cudd was saying, and Stephanie Marshall's been corroborating, I think it's the frontline workers, and then there is the second line, and it's quite clear that in some universities which have got strong medical schools, they themselves became the frontline workers, the faculty and students. But even otherwise, there is the second level of support that comes from intellectuals as well as students involved in their local areas. So I think That's all well taken. Let me shift to Juan Pablo, who is in Mexico, to a different region of the world, and a more of a middle-income country or a developing country context, where the pandemic, like many of us in the global south, Mexico has been hammered and has been very badly impacted by the pandemic. So, and I think the funding crisis for universities has been quite severe, and so has the public health scenario. And like many of us who have been slow or late in vaccines, Mexico is also struggling. So how badly affected has been your university community and the wider society, and what are you doing, Juan Pablo, at Monterrey? What exactly, anything specific or interesting or new initiatives that you have launched, please?
Thank you, Sreeram. Thank you for the invitation, and an honor to be part of this panel and sharing these ideas. So within the pandemic, very early on, we had a very relevant meeting and decision as part of the leadership team of the university, in which we decided which were going to be the guiding principles to make decisions during the pandemic. And that was very useful for us. It has been very useful for us for this last year and a half. We're a private nonprofit university in Mexico. And we are unique in, we're more of a university system. We have 26 campuses across 24 cities. So we have campuses all the way very close to the border with Guatemala, and one that is actually a few miles from the border in the US, and probably campuses across the main cities in Mexico. So when we define these guiding principles, of course, very early on, the first one was making sure that we would take care of the health and well-being of our community. The second one was continuing with high quality education for our students, solidarity with our faculty and the families of our community. But very early on, we understood that we have very strong capabilities in terms of knowledge, talent, convening power, trust that we needed to put at the service of each of our communities. And I think that was a very important game changer. As Stephanie was saying, most of the people that work at our university, they don't do it just for the pay. They do it here because it's an amazing platform to have impact. So the fact that we work in parallel in understanding that we had a strong challenge in continuing taking care of our community and serving our community, but at the same time, we have the tools to help others was very relevant. We do have a medical school, and we actually operate 2 hospitals. So that was a very direct way to help and to put those assets and those capabilities to the service. But we have, for example, a very strong track record in terms of online education. So we set up many courses and resources for other universities across Latin America to be able to scale up and move to an online system. We were very capable of doing it very quickly. We're a large institution. Again, we have 24 campuses. We have 90,000 students. So we managed to actually shift in less than 3 days. But for others, public institutions in Mexico, it was a huge challenge that took them probably a month to do it. And we were part of that process. Also, I think something that is relevant in Mexico, and is probably relevant across other geographies, is trust in institutions is deteriorating fast and has been deteriorating for many decades. And in Mexico, there's an annual survey of trust in institutions. And last year, universities for the first time were the most trusted institutions in the country, even a little bit above the military and even above the Catholic Church. So that gives a lot of, it creates a lot of responsibility for leading universities in the country, because we are the ones that can actually bring different actors together, and we did that. A lot of the, for example, private donations for buying protective equipment for healthcare workers went through tech, even though we were not responsible for the operations of many of the public hospitals. The business leaders and the business community trusted tech more to manage those donations. So we did that service, for example, for the community.
Oh, that's so inspiring to hear, especially Juan Pablo's point about that we are not, we meaning the universities, we are not in it just for money. I think that's a very important point, and indeed, it's amazing to hear that universities are trusted even more than long established institutions of Mexican culture. So it's really, I think, a salute to the fact that they really did this non-profit thing, see, which we talk about. Often people don't realize it. Maybe it's the crisis that suddenly the non-profit element has come forward. And non-profit, of course, is the core idea behind achieving many of the SDGs. Because if it were left simply to accumulation based on self-interest and lack of solidarity, then of course none of these goals can be achieved. I'll come back to Juan Pablo, but let me go across to Professor Chris Glass, who is in the US and who is with the Star Scholars Network. And Chris, the thing is, the panel is all saying that the universities are rising to the occasion. But many people talk about, intense psychological impact and trauma caused by the pandemic and the lasting effects of long COVID, this and that. So clearly, the trauma is not over, neither in the US or in many other parts of the world, and we're barely emerging from it. So what do you think universities have been doing, the universities you've been associated with and which you have seen? And is there anything else you think that they could do, going forward? Because like we said, this is a long crisis.
And thank you very much. And like the other panelists, I'm very happy to join this distinguished panel at this conversation today. I think what I can contribute to the conversation is that the Star Scholars Network is a knowledge partner of this conference. And so the T in STAR relates to transnational. So what does this look like from a global perspective? Because the mission of our organization is supporting the advancement of scholars that are working across borders. We have 15,000 members, roughly 2,000 universities, 50% of those that are in low and lower middle income countries. And I share my colleagues' enthusiasm for the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of a charge for higher education and seeing that happening. But I see a very mixed kind of picture as well. I think the idea is that this is a really difficult time. Many universities around the world are working in extremely difficult economic conditions. And this is particularly with the coronavirus, a really unfavorable moment for them to get really actively involved. Of course, we see things happening at universities or in the Times impact rankings. We see some really great work happening at the upper tiers. But the question, I think, with the Sustainable Development Goals is the idea is that it's to leave no one behind. And so we need to think about that in terms of the universities as well. I would agree very much with Anne's framing. I'm really glad that she began with this way, that universities are really society's critic as well as society's conscience. And I think it's going to be important when we think about the achievement of these goals to ensure that no universities are left behind. And there are many ways in which the goals themselves can be problematic, not just in terms of funding, but in terms of the kinds of headwinds that universities are facing around the world. Broadly speaking, we see great trends with the rise of for-profit universities in many countries that don't have primarily these kind of interests in mind that we've heard so eloquently described by Juan and others. I really appreciated that Stephanie talked about new generations of students that are really leading the change and the importance of but the other headwind I would think we face is Juan mentioned this, is really the challenge of trust in institutions. We're at somewhat of a crisis point in many places, and that reflects itself practically as it relates to this in terms of the defunding of many public institutions. So the challenge for many universities around the world in achieving these is to think about how can we do this in a way where within my country's context, education is getting defunded, it's getting privatized, and I don't have the kinds of resources that might be available for those universities that are highlighted that are doing excellent work in the time impact ratings. I think there's ways in which this can be considered. I'm hopefully going to share that later on in the panel as well. But the idea that there can be kind of this founded optimism that we can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals with the current kind of economic model really puts some of these universities at a disadvantage. And I think it's worth continuing kind of engaging that in the conversation, because broadly speaking, what universities are looking for is to think about how these goals relate to their sense of place, not an abstract kind of global sense of an achievement of a goal, but what does this mean to my community, and learning how to translate that through the teaching, research, and service functions of universities around the world to make sure that no universities are left behind in the achievement of these goals.
Thank you, Chris, for raising this important point, because until now we were talking about the crisis in the wider societies. But you brought home the point that there's a crisis with the universities themselves, and quite a few of them are really on the ropes, and possibly many have even shut down because they simply cannot operate with this online learning and long distance format and all these things. And the loss of tuition and all these things it's a tremendous blow. So yes, and how could one central university be a hub and can actually support weaker universities around it? That itself is an important marker of solidarity, because like we said before, if it's a Darwinian social system where the survival of the fittest, then obviously only the very well endowed and established institutions and the prestigious ones can really survive, and all the others will just have to die in this kind of crisis, long crisis. But ensuring that doesn't happen, and to maintain the ecosystem, that's one of the main SDGs. It comes under the education vertical. Let me come back to that point about supporting other universities. But last but not least, Professor Paul Tonks from Yonsei University in South Korea is with us. And South Korea has been a leader in fighting the pandemic, one of the big successes, especially during the first wave in 2020. Apparently, people say that it has been slow with vaccination, like many of us in Asia, but nonetheless has been quite a leader in terms of pandemic response and controlling the pandemic. And so perhaps the crisis within South Korea was not as extreme as in most of the other societies represented in this panel. But nonetheless, obviously, there's a global crisis and it's affected South Korea very much. And I'm sure certain segments of society have fallen back. So Paul, what have Yonsei is one of the leading institutions of South Korea. How has it led with regard to the goals, local and the global goals in the last year and a half?
Thank you, Sreeram. And like my other co-panelists, I just want to start off by thanking OP Jindal Global University for this great opportunity. It's a real privilege to be with you, and I'm also pleased as I can see that we already have some great partners and collaborations. I've had a lot of meetings even in the last couple of years, colleagues. We have a relatively new agreement with Queen Mary. We have collaborations with Tech de Monterrey, Pittsburgh, in Boston too. So it's a great privilege and pleasure. I want to actually be, I think it partly reflects, as others and Chris was just saying, and going back to Anne and Stephanie too, the importance of place, of the local, the regional, but then try to think about that. I think this word has come up too, that the sort of global responsibilities and the collaborations that hopefully we can bring together uniquely as universities in a way that we can work with both public and private entities, governments, NGOs, also the private sector, corporations, and so forth. As Sreeram introduced, I think in many ways, although of course we don't want to take things for granted or be overly optimistic, but Korea has done, relatively speaking, well. But I think back to Anne's point, which of course struck me as a historian, as an Anglo-American historian, and somebody who's also very much a world historian, and the impacts of colonialism and decolonization and those kind of areas, including working on South Asia, India, and South Asia too. I think it's significant that Korea in many ways learned the lessons. It learned the lessons, even the recent history, MERS, SARS, right? So the mid 2015 or so, the early 2000s, It's had a great focus, I think, on that sort of coordination. I think in some ways, what can, I'm sure we'll come on to this in the future, you know, what can we do as leaders? In some ways, I think we can help to sort of coordinate and bring together expertise, right? We can kind of act as kind of hubs and spokes and bringing together all the networks and resources that we have, the intellectual, the human, the social, and indeed the economic capital. And so I think for Yonsei, if I can speak a little bit more, you know, specifically to us, Yonsei, of course, you know, our own history, Yonsei was founded by medical missionaries. So we have a huge health system and hospitals, and we have a you know, very active school of public health, and we've tried to focus on how we can work with our neighbors and friends, both within the region. You know, we focused a lot. We've had a number of visits and collaborations. For example, leaders from India, Prime Minister. I've regularly met with ambassador and embassy officials and so forth. What Yonsei, I think, has done is kind of build on, then, if you like, which I think we can all in some ways do, pre-existing links and strengthen them. You know, there's of course short-term impacts, and nobody should downplay that. I think, you know, Chris makes important points about challenges, and those of us, you know, who are perhaps somewhat privileged, whether that's privileged in terms of relatively low COVID cases or low overall, you know, burdening of health systems and so on, or just, you know, the amounts of funding that we might have available through, you know, private donations or various resources that we can draw on. So we have to be very much humble and acknowledging challenges for our colleagues, particularly in the global south and in developing countries. But of course, Korea, I believe I'm correct in saying, is the only country that has gone from being a major, massive recipient of overseas aid to an overseas donor country. But we want to, I think Korea also offers something, you know, learning the lessons that, if you like, the good and the bad of very rapid development, very rapid modernization. In many ways, South Korea has probably had the most extreme history of the 20th century, right? And its growth is particularly rapid. It's had lots of challenges, but ultimately has been able to achieve genuine democracy, genuinely empowerment of the civil society. And I think at the heart of it, you know, if one looked at all the kind of the key metrics, the indicators, the kind of things we look at to evaluate SDGs, there would be one word, there'd be one term, and it'd be education, right? In the early 1960s, you know, the 50s and 60s, the GDP of the Republic of Korea was basically exactly the same as Afghanistan and Somalia, right? In the aftermath of the Korean War, the country was basically, you know, literally flattened, right? There was very low levels of educational opportunity, you know, in the sort of post-colonial early independence period, the immediate, obviously, catastrophe of this brutal civil war. And then from that, Korea and Yonsei played an important role in that. We focused on education, and we focused, I think, with an ethos and values. And I think this is something that I'm sure we all share. How can we lead for service? And I think the SDGs are encouraging us to adopt a global perspective, to look to partner with those who have particular challenges, but we can share and learn lessons of both success and failure. You know, what has gone well, what hasn't gone so well, what have been, you know, some of the drawbacks, and we see that with the SDGs, right? It's not just like raw quantitative economic growth; it has to be sustainable. And so Yonsei in particular, I think roughly speaking, about a decade ago, we built a new campus quite near the main international airport in Korea, Incheon, you know, Songdo. And this is very much focused on being an international and global campus. And of course, we've worked with the UN and other bodies. You know, we have on campus, you know, Office of the UN Development Program. We have in Songdo the Green Climate Fund. You know, we're very much focused on green growth, on sustainability. And I think that's something where Yonsei can genuinely be in the forefront, you know, working with our partners in the US, you know, in Mexico, in the UK, in South Asia. We can learn from each other, share experience, what has worked, you know, and I think in some ways, you know, the kind of unique development of Korea, its rapidity, but now we're able to, I think, kind of in a sense, rethink, we can't aim at just like total, growth as an end in and of itself. But I think we have to step back. I think, as Anne said at the very beginning, we have to think about the fundamental ethos, the fundamental values, the philosophy. So that's where we can, and I think most of us are focused on this, collaborations across disciplinary boundaries, across the university, social sciences, humanities, of course, the natural, laboratory sciences, medical sciences. I mean, one core thing that I participated in recently through my own office, our international office at Yonsei, and I think it links to Stephanie too. We had a course that we offered online on COVID-19. And so we had a variety. One of my senior colleagues, an economist, myself as a historian, actually, I gave the opening lecture. Let's learn the lesson of plagues and pandemics, right? And then work with, one of my colleagues who's a very senior biochemist is head of the Pasteur Institute in Korea, and obviously an expert in virology. So we were able to bring things together and then share expertise. By doing it online has allowed us to reach a much larger audience, and we've been able to do it in a variety of courses. And in the kinds of courses that traditionally we would offer exchange students, visiting students coming in person to Korea, now we're able to do it online. We launched a lot of new online programs with our new president who came into office last year. So it was immediately, literally arrived, February 2020. So talking about crisis management and leadership challenges. But joking aside, he already had a vision. Of course, we had strategic goals. Stephanie was saying, what's our kind of long-term goals? How can we do that? Things like embedding in the curriculum. Looking at, what does this class contribute? How is it dealing with SDGs? Community-based learning. I think like you have at OP Jindal Global, we have an Institute for Higher Education Innovation. I think one of the areas where Yonsei has been very successful that I hope with humility we can offer to others, and Korea itself probably more broadly is can be a model of this constructively. SDG 9, working with industry, the private sector to innovate. I think the first THE rankings we all like to talk about is like, that was the one where we were for the first ever time, #1 in the world in SDG 9, and we're still obviously doing very well overall in SDGs. And that's because I think we put a lot of emphasis.
And conscious planning,
former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, we set up an institute for global engagement and empowerment. And then we instituted a global economic empowerment forum for sustainable development just a year or two before this all kicked in. That was kind of founded in 2017-18. And so we already had this focus and framework. As I said, our international campus in Songdo, we're working with the UN. We're looking at things like green growth, sustainability, environmental issues. So I think that's something where I hope we can, with appropriate humility and recognition, as Chris was saying, the challenges that many institutions face, particularly in parts of the global south or in areas like, countries like India that have been tremendously hard hit. I hope we can share and cooperate and learn from each other. And I think universities, including Yonsei, do have something very distinctive to give there that can be a genuine, education as public good, I think, as you were saying.
Thank you, Paul. I think one of the points Paul raised, and I'll go back to Anne about this, is the sharing of knowledge and best practices and research with the view not only with our immediate neighborhood, but with the broader international community. And that, of course, some of the best universities in the world are doing it. And that's where US universities obviously have been the leaders in terms of internationalization, in terms of feeding into policy making and public health approaches, epidemiology. I mean, you name it. So, and what has your experience at Pitt been about this, and how have you contributed? And I know you're a very globally networked institution, so it's a global crisis. It's not just a local one. So, what have you? What anything unique that you've done in the last year and a half, 2 years around the SDGs and around the pandemic for the rest of the world? Have you shared? I know many of your scholars write a lot about this, but any specific policy inputs you've fed into public health issues internationally and within the US?
Yeah, well, as I said before, and I think this is true of many of the universities represented here, is we have a vast medical center and health system, and I think most specifically to the point of the pandemic, one of the things that the University of Pittsburgh has done is joined with the global researchers on vaccine research, and so we have a center for vaccine research. We were one of the first universities to receive a sample of the virus. And so, that really has been a very global effort, trying many different kinds of vaccines. And then, of course, as the vaccines started to emerge, mobilizing our epidemiologists, our public health to do the testing of the vaccines and to run testing not only on vaccines, but also on all kinds of treatments for COVID. For example, the steroid treatment was one of the things that came out of the University of Pittsburgh research very early on, and has been an important treatment, not a vaccine, but a treatment for the sort of autoimmune effects of COVID. So I think we've done a lot in terms of that, and that's been just a huge global network. I mean, it just goes without saying that our researchers, and this is what I think the global network of universities has done so well in the last half century, is grow this global network of sharing of research and knowledge at the leading edge of health and medical research. And when I look at the faculty we have in our health sciences and in our medical school, they're from all over the world. They're from rich countries and poor countries. They're from everywhere. They are the best and the brightest, and they're also bringing that kind of experience from different universities around the world, different ways of looking at and mobilizing healthcare and health policy. So I think that's one thing. Another thing that we've started, we started before the pandemic, but it really has nicely pivoted in terms of our research, is it's called the Pittsburgh study. It's just one of those many epidemiological databases that we're trying to construct that studies all children, actually from prenatal to 18, and all aspects of health and well-being, because we're really focused on the fact that health and well-being is only, as our senior vice chancellor for the health sciences likes to say, it's 20% biological, it's 80% cultural and social. And that, we've been very focused, for instance, in Pittsburgh, on the terrible effects of racism on our Black community, for example, in particular, and how that has very adversely affected maternal health, infant mortality, and things like that. And we are also seeing that, of course, in the effects of the pandemic, and we're tracing these things. So I think, building these databases, building the data infrastructure to be able to understand that is both local and global, right? The Pittsburgh study that is going to study millions of children in Pittsburgh from pre-birth to adulthood is going to provide a wealth of data for the entire world, but also it's going to help us to find, for example, why is it that children in this neighborhood have much higher rates of asthma? Well, actually, we know why it is. It's because of the steel mill over there. But what can we do in terms of policies, and how can we share that knowledge throughout the world? So I would say that's just as our research is both local and global, the efforts towards the sustainability goals, sustainable development goals, had a pre-pandemic, infrastructure building phase and then the pandemic has, as I think Paul talked about this, really motivated a certain kind of intensity, and also probably pivoted in some ways the research of many people, but to the immediate pandemic, but will pay off in the motivation and the energy and the passion that it has brought forward of our students, our faculty, to solve global crises, which we see very clearly have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Before I give up the spotlight, I just want to also mention the other pandemic that we've dealt with in the United States, the pandemic of racism, which I know that actually, I mean, we've come to call it that. It is global as well. We've noticed a global Black Lives Matter movement, but in the United States, it's particularly acute, and we really have a racial reckoning to undergo. That's really urgent. And I mentioned, you know, the studies of health and well-being and the adverse effects on the Black community. The pandemic has also motivated, I think, the intensity of focus on this other pandemic as well. And I'm both grateful for that, and we've also done one of these online massive online courses that's focused. This was one focused on anti-Black racism. And every one of our first-year students took this course. So that was, nearly 6,000 students in the first year. This year, we may or may not get that many students, but we'll get a lot. And we've also shared that out with the world. And I think, there are many ways that universities have become focused and should become focused on inequality and lowering inequality as we can, as well as, responding to the pandemic.
Thank you. And in fact, SDGs, equality is like the bedrock principle of all the SDGs. And like Anne was, in fact, we know, for example, in the US, the people of color were, disproportionately died from the pandemic and were affected by it. So there's no question about how the pandemic, in a way, focused a light on pre-existing structural injustices, and the universities obviously ought to uncover that for a reckoning. But also what intrigued me was Anne's point about sharing knowledge and building databases. And there's been a lot of talk of vaccine nationalism or just narrow nationalism generally in the pandemic, and of course many countries have stockpiled vaccines, and it's been highly iniquitous, especially for developing countries, as they just wait for the jabs to come. But what is interesting is that may be national policy, like political top leaderships and so on, but the universities have not been narrow-minded, and that's a source of hope, right? Because we have all looked out for each other, and there's been this a shared sense of solidarity throughout this crisis. And the fact that the database, I know this Our World in Data that is run by Oxford University, the Johns Hopkins data on casualties and sick people, all these are widely cited, and without those we have no inkling about the overall picture. The big picture is coming from universities. So that and it is open source, and it is being shared on a free basis across the world without being charged. So I think those are, big accomplishments we can be proud of, even though a lot remains to be desired. So we are a little short on time. So I'll request panelists to get crisper with responses. So let me do one more round, and then we'll try and take some audience questions, which I hope are coming. Stephanie, the UK universities, Russell Group, all of you have been, of course, also sharing knowledge in a big way, and you have been looked up to internationally. But tell me something, and this is, I've been wondering about it. If the universities are full of such brilliant and smart and generous people, like we hope we all are, why is it that our countries as a whole have almost all failed? South Korea is probably an exception in this panel, but all of us have not been up to the mark when it came to the pandemic, or when it came to somehow saving lives and protecting the health of our citizens. What is the disjuncture? I mean, it looks like for all that we try to do with the wider societies and communities, at the end of the day, it still looks like we are in a bubble. And we seem to have the right ideas. We are all advocating for the right things to be done. But then the governments and the wider, even the COVID appropriate behavior by the rest of society has not been so encouraging and not so. How do you explain the disjuncture? I mean, we want to be change agents, but let's be honest, we have not been able to change or fundamentally shift the bring back the SDGs on rail. We are just like still a drop in the ocean. There's this wider society and polity and probably even the business community which hasn't done as much as we would like. So how do you square the fact that maybe we are just oasis in the middle of a stormy ocean, and the universities are still like in our little turfs? We seem to be doing the best we can, but it's not really having that big of an impact in the bigger picture.
Excellent question, I have to say. And I have to say, I think we've had some really, really brilliant perspectives from different panelists. But if I could just go back a step, if we look at some of the super governmental agencies like the World Health Organization, I mean, I could go into UNESCO, I could go into OECD, etc. But I think at least the World Health Organization is trying to get the learning from everybody across the piece. And certainly we're involved in a number of projects there. But I'll go right back to a few of my predecessors on the panel in terms of what they presented. One, Pablo, to hear that universities are the most trusted in the country, I just thought, isn't that wonderful? I just was absolutely amazed. I heard Anne talking about all the amazing things that we're doing, and so many of the different initiatives you're involved in are so similar to Queen Mary. And I'm just thinking, where are all those massive databases and the analysis of comorbidities against people of color? Because it is a real inequality that we're determined to get on top of. But then also listening to Paul in terms of saying, the success in Korea was because they actually learned from the past. Within Britain, we were saying, why haven't we learned from the past? Why hasn't there been an the emergency plan ready to implement, which is really, really disturbing. If you think within our universities, we've all got crisis management plans ready. If this happens, this is the way we respond. You just look at the way universities responded, given that, it looks as if it's a global pandemic, we're going to have to shut down. Kind of overnight, we had everything online because we just jumped into action. The government didn't do so. I'll leave that one for you to ponder on, rather than getting myself embroiled in some sort of a political debate. But I just think we've had we're hearing some different perspectives as well from different nations, which I think is absolutely fascinating. But everybody on this panel coming from a university is absolutely passionate about universities being a force for the public good. And I think that's across all the SDGs. And I think, please don't drill too deeply with me in terms of some of these issues, because it hasn't been for want of trying. Because I think in Britain, some of the best scientists, the best brains have been, they're involved in SAGE, the advisory group to the government in terms of how we need to proceed. But at the end of the day, if you've not got a contingency plan, as Korea had, you're going to be on the back foot, aren't you?
Thank you, Stephanie. I think you hit the nail on the head. So there is this disjuncture, and maybe we in the ivory tower have not been able to really impact top policymakers as much as we would like to. I mean, some of the top, public health experts, epidemiologists, development specialists, they were all raising the alarms about this, and some had even foreseen a pandemic, but of course the governments and the society at large was unprepared and unwilling to make the sacrifices probably needed. So I guess ultimately, as intellectual centers, Juan Pablo, even Mexico, you are a big institution. Mexican, there's a long tradition of intellectuals influencing policy, but clearly many of the things we were saying fell on deaf ears, and the authorities and the decision makers made their own, and even general society didn't seem to. Or was there, you think, the way we pitched it, the universities, the way we framed our advisory or our expertise, was there something lacking in it, you think? Or were we just too caught up in our jargon and in our specialized disciplines that we just didn't do enough in the public space to influence the general public and the governments to act faster and think quicker and to be more proactive? The scholarship versus the broader body politic, that's the point I'm trying to ask. In Mexico also, it looked like, we have been following the politics, and the top leaderships had a different view altogether about the crisis and about intervening and state intervention and all that. So clearly, so what do you think we as intellectuals could do more, or do better next time? I think now with these extreme weather patterns and incidents going on around the world, with the flooding and the fires, I think we are going to see more and more crises. This is only the first. Looks like we have to brace for decades of crises now, one after the other. So how can we as universities, walk the talk and make things change, in the real world, quote unquote, outside the ivory tower?
I think a very specific idea will be to change our mindset as to what is our mandate. Because I think in many ways, we think that if we come up with the idea or the data or the technical solution, then we have done our job. And I think we need to understand that our actual mandate is to have the social impact and actually move the needle in whatever we are trying to do. And I think generating that culture and that mindset within our faculty and with our communities is very relevant. I also think that in the case of Mexico, but I think it happens everywhere, we need to be careful of generalizing, because we did find that there were some authorities that were not listening to what the experts were saying, but there were others that were. And so finding which ones of them are more willing to collaborate, I think it's important. Also, something that worked for us is if they were not listening to ideas that were coming out from Tec de Monterrey, we actually partnered with other universities, some of them public universities that were closer to the government and that had stronger ties. So, and with companies and with NGOs, so it becomes harder for the government not to listen when you are a part of a stronger coalition. I think those are some. And within Tec de Monterrey, part of our DNA, we're very entrepreneurial and impact driven. So I think we suffer a little bit less than other universities, although we still can have a lot more impact. And it should be a mindset shift of understanding what our mission and our job is with the society.
Thank you. No, though that makes sense. I think coalition building, perhaps we have limited ourselves to our own community and our own tribe, and we believe that we are making sense, but then it's not probably percolating to many other sections and institutions in the society. And I'm just trying to also look at the questions that are coming in from the audience to see if there's something that will be of interest, which maybe I can throw to Chris. Chris, there's somebody in the audience asking, can SDGs be embedded into all aspects of university life, teaching, research, community engagement? I guess the answer is yes. And some of our colleagues in the panel have already been giving examples of how they have been embedded already. But your thoughts on this, especially when you work with universities in developing countries, the challenges of a bigger scale, especially because they don't have big social safety nets and stimulus packages that governments can spend to lift societies out of these kind of crises and to put them back on track. So is there something universities can do to embed it into learning itself in such a way that as I'm saying, the crises are going to keep recurring. It looks like we are in an era of crises now, one after the other. And what does it mean? That can we prepare the next generation of citizens of our respective countries around the world by training them in such a way? It used to be said about peace education in conflict areas, that once you do peace education, it will try and limit the urge for revenge, and also which recreate the cycles of violence in war-torn societies. But could we do a SDG type embedding into the minds of young people already? We heard that number of universities, the students already swear by these anyway. But what I'm saying is maybe more systematically, and could we do that as a big campaign globally to embed SDGs into learning and such a way that they're always there, and in a way, a new kind of consciousness comes out with the next generation that will enter the real world after passing out of universities?
Yeah, thank you so much. Since we have a short amount of time, I'll try to be bold with my response. The answer is no, we can't if we don't change the fundamental logics that are driving the SDG that will be inclusive of all types of institutions. There's some Anglo-Saxon epistemologies that are embedded in those, as well as current organizational forms aren't always structured where every university can do everything. Yes, if you're in the higher education ranking, you can do that. But we really need to be thinking about post-developmental universities as advocated by Tristan McCowan, University College London. We need to think about new forms, new structures, new clusters, new ways of knowledge sharing. Certainly there needs to be knowledge sharing that are happening at our elite universities, but we also need to reimagine knowledge sharing of clusters of institutions that can share knowledge, but in new kinds of organizational forms. So that's going to be absolutely essential. Two types of things: new types of organizational forms, new ways of understanding what the university is, as well as new forms of clusters. And what I'd say is that the world does face an existential crisis. Noam Chomsky said, this is the last generation that will face climate change, because either we will deal with climate change or this will be the last generation. That is the kind of urgency that we need to face with our universities. But not every single university can do what the elite universities can do, or even well-funded public universities can do as well. And so we need to think about, how are we funding and structuring these universities? Let me give you a quick analogy just to drive home this point. Let's pretend that every single elite university in the world, rather than using standardized test scores and grades and GPAs, decide to use height as a way to determine who is admitted, who is not. The highest students are admitted, the shortest students are not. Generation after generation, our world leaders are taller. The people who are successful scientists are taller. Is that because taller people are more capable? No, it's because we've chosen to have a system that rewards certain kinds of things and minimizes other types of things. The reason some universities are not the best at achieving these goals are because they haven't received the kind of resources. Until that kind of fundamental re-questioning has been asked, I don't think every university can't change in the same kind of way. So I hope I'll just kind of leave that. I know I only have a few minutes, but hopefully that kind of gives you the answer. The answer is yes, I think everyone should involve. No one should be left behind. That is the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals. But the answer is no in the current form, unless we rethink some of these things, or at least bring in some of these logics of epistemology. Because I really want to emphasize again what Anne said, is we really have to think about the legacies of colonialism, the legacies of racism that we have inherited, that we have the ability to rewrite. And then I think, yes, then everyone can embed these types of things in every aspect of the university if we reimagine that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So Chris, you've taken a critical position, and I think it's important to examine something deeper. What Chris is saying is that we've got to get to a deeper level and self-introspect as to how our ontological or basic purpose of universities. We all like to do good, and we always are good at presenting the positive aspects of what we do, but there may be inequity structured into even our own the academe, and of course that also needs to be examined. So we are almost out of time, but let me go to Paul for last word before we close. There is a question, Paul, about what are universities doing about the mental health of our own students and faculty. Obviously, many of us have gone through a very harrowing time, and it's not just the SDGs, which is an abstract thing and a goal, but human beings, ordinary human beings, including all of us professors and students. So mental health issues and the lingering effects of this are going to be really bad. So what are universities doing? What is your university doing? What could we do more? Is there something that we could learn and apply across the board among all our partners?
Thank you, Sreeram. Yeah, that's a very important question. I think we certainly, as Chris was saying, this is a kind of opportunity to be genuinely self-reflective and self-analytical and self-critical, and see the things that we need to improve. As you say, even places that may in some ways be kind of perceived and in some measures seem to succeed more than others, which I think is significant, because I think in some ways, and there's a lot of anxieties about this, I think, in the traditional kind of Anglo-Saxon leading countries, as Chris referred to. I think obviously in many parts of the world, I think particularly in Asia, traditionally there's been sort of stigmas around mental health. And I think there's a growing openness. In Korea, I think, as you probably know, unfortunately, if one is looking at sort of metrics, Korea is always at the very top of rates of suicide and self-harm and mental health issues. And that's the flip side of which I think it links back to Juan, Pablo and Stephanie and others, and the sort of the issue of universities' reputation, role of education. I know that's something very important in India, to Indian society and culture, this kind of focus on education and this drive. The flip side can be, those who are perhaps, don't get in on these standardized tests and so on, this ultra competition. And even some of those who do, they're feeling isolation and anxiety, particularly, if they don't have the physical social interactions. And a lot of the aspects, of course, of, let's say, of undergraduate education is precisely forming these social networks and interacting with peers. So for us at Yonsei, although that isn't my own remit, we do obviously have a counseling center. I mean, I think there are quite some challenges around the international. Obviously I'm in the international office. Of course, language and cultural issues are significant. Yonsei is relatively internationalized. We do have, literally thousands of international students coming with a full-time or for periods exchange and language learning and so on. And there are issues, obviously, living in a country where the language is not shared or is not widely spoken amongst some of the international learners. But we try to, I think, particularly my own college, the Underwood International College, where I'm a faculty, we have a strong system of mentoring. We have a special kind of faculty mentors, special professors who are focused basically on mentoring students in a holistic way.
Yeah, and those have presumably gone up because a lot of young people are complaining of depression.
Yes, I mean, I've seen that myself, and I'm sure some of our colleagues in some of my own classes. I've tried to flag, in each way, that those faculty or special advisors have reached out and tried to encourage, the lecturers, the teachers to say, are you encountering students with problems? So, last semester there were 2 or 3 students, and I could see patterns where they weren't attending, or their camera was switched off, or they weren't handing in a report or whatever. And I tried to reach out proactively to them. In some cases, it wasn't wholly successful. But then what I would do is I would refer them. I would contact counselors and mentors and advisors and ask them and say, look, I'm worried. I think that in some cases I set up meetings and I had a half-hour. In some ways, actually, the benefits of the technology of the Zoom, I could set up some and I'd be flexible and say, okay, I understand, your schedule. Let's set up.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but yes, we see similarities in all of us trying to help young people and help ourselves.
Sure.
We are almost out of time. I want to thank the panel. I'm sorry there wasn't more time. It's fascinating to discuss this, but I think the sum of all that you're saying is that the universities are a force for good. They ought to be a force for good. And they have not just done crisis fighting, but they are upholding the SDGs, and they should be an important pillar for implementing the SDGs. The last SDG is about cooperation to fulfill the other goals. There are other 16. And I think that is the goal number 17 is where universities are playing a big role. We ought to do a lot more for the crisis. Maybe lessons have to be shared at a wider level, but I think there is hope at the end of this long crisis. We will see light. Thank you all. Thank you so much for being part of this wonderful panel. Thank you. It's been an honor.